The spring rains had softened the Texas earth into a dark clay that clung to boots and horse hooves alike. Evelyn Ashford Zeller stood at the edge of the field skirt hem tucked into her belt so she could dig alongside her husband. The air smelled of wet mesquite and the faint sweetness of wild plum blossoms drifting down from the ridge. She pressed the handle of the spade into the ground, leaned her weight against it, and felt the resistance give way. Orion was a few feet ahead, broad back bent to his own work sleeves rolled high. When he paused to straighten, the sun caught the lines of sweat along his jaw and the quiet patience in his eyes. They had planted apple and plum saplings weeks before, and each day she checked the buds like a mother worried over a child. Now it was time for corn rows of it enough to see them through winter and perhaps trade with neighbors when the harvest came. Evelyn brushed loose strands of hair from her face and remembered how only months ago she had thought she might never stand on her own land, never call any place safe. Yet here she was, hands cracked and sore, body aching but heart steady. Each furrow she opened in the soil felt like carving her name deeper into the life she was building. Orion drove the stakes to mark the rows, his hammering steady methodical. When she stopped to rest, he walked over and offered the water gourd without a word. She drank the cool liquid spilling against her lips, then passed it back. Their eyes met briefly, not needing speech. The rhythm between them had grown like the rhythm of the ranch itself. Chores at dawn, repairs at midday, quiet suppers by firelight. Love was not spoken often, but lived in the way he saved her, the warm side of the bed, or in how she mended his shirt with careful stitches that held against strain. In town, people had begun to speak of them as if they had always belonged together. Some still looked sideways, whispering about the woman who had run from Oklahoma, about the gunshot that had echoed across the ridge when Ralston came hunting. But Orion bore those looks with the same quiet strength he bore weather or loss, and Evelyn found that in his silence she discovered her own courage. Once she would have shrunk from eyes that judged. Now she lifted her chin not defiantly, but with a calm that said she had survived worse than words. That evening, after the tools were cleaned and set by the shed, they sat on the porch watching the horizon turn the color of cooling embers. Cicadas hummed in the grass, and the creek carried the last of the day's light in silver streaks. Orion carved a new piece of wood in his hands, small shavings falling onto his boots. Evelyn rocked gently in the chair he had fixed for her, humming under her breath as she often did now. The tune had no name, just the soft release of a heart no longer braced against harm. "We'll need to mend the roof before summer storms," Orion said, finally not looking up from his carving. "I'll climb with you," she answered. His mouth curved almost into a smile. "Reckon I'd rather you keep your feet on the ground." She tilted her head, pretending to be insulted. "I've balanced on worse. Fences with nails sticking out, ladders missing rungs. You think a roof will scare me?" He chuckled low, and the sound warmed her more than the quilt across her knees. He set the carving down on the porch rail. It was shaping into a bird with wings half spread, and leaned back, stretching his legs. "Not fear I'm thinking on. Just don't like the idea of you falling when I can climb for the both of us." Her eyes softened. "And if you fall," he met her gaze steady as always, "then you'll catch me, won't you?" The words lingered between them, more than jest, less than solemn vow. But enough. Evelyn reached across and placed her hand on his. Calluses met calluses, warmth meeting warmth. The night settled around them, stars pricking holes through the dark, and she thought of how far she had come from that night of running smoke stinging her eyes, heart clutched in terror. She had chosen his arms, and every day since had been the proof of why. Later, when they banked the fire and lay beneath the heavy quilt, Evelyn listened to the steady beat of Orion's heart under her cheek. Outside, the wind moved gently through the saplings, brushing their branches against each other like a chorus of whispers. She closed her eyes and whispered a single word into the quiet, a word that felt like planting another seed home. The days lengthened, and with them came a restlessness that carried on the breeze. By late May, the hills of Texas hill country shifted from tender green to the heavier shade of summer growth. Grasshoppers clicked through the fields, and the air was thick with the scent of sun-warmed cedar. Evelyn rose early, tying her hair back with a strip of faded muslin, and walked to the chicken coop with a basket on her arm. The hens had grown fat under her care, and she gathered eggs with practiced ease, murmuring soft thanks as she slid them into straw. Orion was already at the barn when she returned, muscles working steady as he hoisted a saddle onto the bay mare. He had promised to help a neighbor with a stray calf, but before leaving he checked the latch on the coop, the hinges on the shed, the smallest details most men would ignore. Evelyn watched him from the porch arms, folded, and felt again that steadying weight of his presence. Even when he rode away, the echo of his care remained. She spent the morning boiling jars for preserves, humming as steam clouded the kitchen. Her hands moved sure-slicing peaches into golden crescents, pressing lids tight. Each jar she filled was more than food. It was proof of permanence. She remembered a time when she carried nothing but the clothes on her back, when everything she touched felt borrowed, fragile, doomed to be lost. Now she laid each jar on the shelf with a small surge of triumph. Here at last she could keep something. By noon, clouds gathered to the west, thick as wool. Thunder rolled across the ridge and the sky darkened until the hearth fire glowed against the dim interior. Evelyn brought in the laundry just before the rain broke. The downpour struck hard, hammering the roof, spilling into the barrels Orion had set beneath the eaves. She stood at the window, watching water rush down the slope, and thought how storms no longer filled her with dread. This cabin, with its patched shingles and oak beams, held firm. She belonged inside it not as a guest, but as the keeper of its warmth. When Orion returned drenched and mud-spattered, she had dry clothes waiting by the fire. He stripped his shirt without hesitation, steam rising from his skin, and she handed him a towel. He nodded, thanks, quiet as ever, and for a moment she just watched him, the scars along his ribs, the weight of years etched into his frame. Not all storms came from the sky. Some lived in the body and memory, in the ache of old wounds. Yet he bore them as he bore rain, steady, uncomplaining. That night after supper, he spoke little. He sat with his boots by the hearth, rubbing oil into the leather eyes half-shadowed by firelight. Evelyn sewed in silence until at last she set her needle down. "You carry more than you let on," she said softly. His hand paused, then resumed its slow rhythm. "We all do." She leaned forward. "But you don't have to alone." He looked at her, then the flicker of fire catching in his eyes. "Maybe I've just grown used to it." She rose, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. Her hands covered his, halting the motion of cloth against boot. "You don't need to be used to it anymore," she whispered. He studied her for a long time, jaw tight, breath steady. Then he set the boot aside and touched her cheek, rough thumb tracing a line just below her eye. "And what of you, Evelyn Ashford Zeller? You think I don't see the nights you wake with your fists clenched like you're still running?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, but honesty had become their covenant. "I'm learning to stop," she admitted. He pressed his forehead to hers, and for a moment the storm outside, the fire within, the years behind all, blurred into one silence that held them both. The weeks that followed turned busy. Fences to mend calves, to brand fields to hoe. They rose with the dawn and worked until muscles ached. Yet each evening, when they sat side by side on the porch, their quiet felt earned, like the land itself had granted them rest. One night Orion brought out a piece of wood, smoother than any she had seen him carve before. It was shaped into two figures, seated beneath a tree, rough yet unmistakable. He set it in her hands. "For us," he said simply. Her eyes stung, though she did not weep. She traced the ridges of the carving, the way the branches arched above the figures, and whispered, "I'll keep it safe." "That's why I made it," he replied. When July came, so did heat that shimmered off the ground like glass. Water from the creek ran low, and the cattle grew restless, tongues lolling. Evelyn rose earlier, still carrying buckets before the sun rose, full, her dress sticking to her skin, hair damp. Orion worked bare-armed beneath the weight of the sun, his back-brown muscles roped with strain. They said little, saving breath, but every glance they shared spoke of endurance, of pushing through side by side. One afternoon, as she hung linen stiff with heat, a rider came down the trail. Not Ralston, he was gone for good, but a stranger face shaded by a wide-brimmed posture, cautious. Evelyn stiffened, heart jumping, but Orion stepped from the barn before she could call. The man carried news from town. A family moving west had been ambushed near the crossing, their wagon taken. The marshal was calling for men to ride search. Orion's eyes met hers, asking before he spoke. She swallowed the fear rising sharp in her chest. "Go," she said quietly. "They'll need you." He left at dawn the next day, rifle across his saddle. Evelyn watched until he vanished down the ridge, then turned back to the house with resolve. Waiting was its own kind of labor. She tended the animals, watered the saplings, stitched another seam. Each task kept her hands from trembling, her mind from wandering into dark places. Still, when night came and the bed lay cold beside her, she curled tight and whispered into the pillow, "Come back." 3 days later, near dusk, hoofbeats pounded up the trail. She ran to the porch, skirts gathered, and saw him dust-streaked, weary but whole. He swung down from the saddle, and before he could speak, she was in his arms, holding fast. He smelled of smoke and sweat and iron, but to her it was the scent of return. "Didn't know if you'd," she began, voice breaking. "I said I'd come back," he interrupted gently. She buried her face against his chest, tears hot against her skin. "I believed you. I just needed to feel it." He kissed the top of her head, arms closing like the promise he had made months before on that porch. Not a vow of words, but of presence. The night after Orion returned, the house felt different. The walls seemed warmer, the fire steadier, the silence deeper, but easier to breathe. Evelyn laid the table with what she had: cornbread baked in the iron skillet, beans simmered long in salt pork, a jar of peaches open for sweetness. She wanted him to eat, to rest, to know she had kept the home waiting. He sat across from her, moving slow, his face lined from sun and strain. But when his eyes lifted to hers, the quiet between them spoke more than any words. After supper, he leaned back in his chair, watching her gather dishes. "How'd you manage while I was gone?" She paused, drying her hands on her apron. "Same way I managed before. One task at a time. Though the nights were longer, they were for me too." He said it low, as though confessing something. Then he pushed to his feet, walked over, and took the dish from her hands. "Let me," she protested, but he only shook his head, rolling up his sleeves. Side by side, they washed plates, shoulders, brushing in the small space. Evelyn found herself smiling at the simple comfort of it. This was what she had longed for, without even knowing: partnership in the smallest labors. When the dishes were stacked and the fire banked, they stepped outside. The air was still heavy with heat, though stars shimmered sharp above. Orion carried a bucket of water to the trough, poured slow, then set it down. He leaned against the porch rail, arms folded, and she joined him, pressing close enough to feel his warmth. "The marshal says the family's safe," he murmured, gaze fixed on the dark hills. "We got there in time." "And you?" she asked. His eyes shifted to her, steady. "I'm here." They lingered under the sky until the crickets sang them back inside. Days passed and life returned to its rhythm. Yet something had shifted. Evelyn no longer felt like a woman rescued and sheltered. She felt like half of a whole. When she walked the fields, she saw the rows, not as Orion's crops, but theirs. When she mended shirts, the stitches bound her life into his. She began sketching plans for a second room, lines rough on scrap paper, but full of possibility. One morning in late July, she found Orion near the shed, examining the roof line. "Thinking we could extend out this way," he said, pointing. "Give us space for another bed, maybe a window facing the ridge." Her heart quickened, though she tried to sound casual. "Why another bed?" He glanced at her, a flicker of a smile tugging his mouth. "A house ought to grow with the people in it." The hint lay between them, tender as the buds on their saplings. She touched her belly instinctively, though there was no change yet, only the thought of what might come. By August, the heat pressed merciless. Water barrels stood low and dust coated every surface, no matter how often she swept. Still, the corn pushed tall tassels golden against the sky. Evelyn worked with her hands in the soil, pulling weeds, staking stalks, feeling the earth answer her care. One evening, as sweat streaked her temples, she straightened to find Orion watching from the fence. He carried 2 mugs of cider, cool from the cellar. "You'll wear yourself down," he said. "And you won't," she countered, wiping her brow. He passed her the mug, eyes soft. "I can't stop you from working, but I can stand with you while you do." They drank together as the sun bled crimson across the horizon. Cicadas shrilled the world, humming with life. She felt the ache in her body, yes, but also the steady drum of belonging. When September rolled in, the first storms cracked open the sky. Rain lashed the fields, bending corn, but not breaking it. Thunder shook the cabin, and Evelyn pressed close to Orion in the dark, listening to the world rage outside. Each crack of lightning reminded her of that night months ago when she had run through smoke and gunfire. But this storm, though fierce, was one she faced with shelter and arms that held firm. On the 3rd day of rain, when the creek swelled near the banks, Orion found her at the window, staring out. Thinking of leaving, he asked quietly. She shook her head, astonished. Never again. Storms come, storms go. But I have roots here now. He nodded once, as if he had been waiting for those words. Then he drew her close, lips brushing her hair. So do I. Autumn brought the harvest. They cut corn in golden waves, stacked it in neat bundles. Neighbors came to help, and for the first time, Evelyn felt part of a wider circle. Women praised her preserves. Men nodded respect when she lifted buckets without flinching. She carried herself with quiet pride, no longer a runaway, no longer a victim, but a wife and partner whose work showed plain. When the last sheaf was stored, they held a small supper with those who had lent hands. Laughter filled the cabin, boots scuffed the porch, and the scent of roasted pork lingered long after. Evelyn stood by the fire, watching Orion speak with a neighbor, his face easier, lighter than she had ever seen. She realized then how much weight he had carried alone before her. Together they had begun to lay it down. Later that night, when the cabin was quiet again, Orion set his hands on her waist and pulled her close. This house feels different, he murmured. Because it's full, she answered. He kissed her slow and certain as outside the saplings rustled in the autumn wind, marking time with their growing. The first cold wind came from the north, like a hand passing over the hills, smoothing the grass flat and rinsing the sky to a pale, hard blue. Evelyn felt it in her bones when she stepped onto the porch at dawn, a clean edge to the air that lifted the hair on her arms. She pulled Orion's old wool coat tighter and listened to the quiet creak of the windmill. The saplings shivered their last leaves, turning the color of old brass. Winter had not arrived yet, but its footsteps were on the path. They began cutting more wood. Orion sharpened the axe on the whetstone until the ring of steel on stone carried across the yard. Evelyn stacked the split logs in a neat crisscross along the wall where the winter sun would dry them. The work warmed them enough that they shed their layers, breath ghosting in the air, forearms burning. Now and then she stopped to flex her fingers and study the sky, reading the thin, high clouds that told of cold nights ahead. At noon they took their meal on the porch steps backs against the post, sharing bread spread with peach preserve. Orion's hands were nicked and stained from the day's work. When he reached to brush a crumb from her lip, she caught his wrist gently and held it there, feeling the steady beat beneath his skin. It calmed her in a way words never had. After a time he leaned in, set his forehead to hers, and the quiet between them grew wide and kind. In town the talk had shifted from harvest to winter stores and fences, to shore before frost heave. Orion rode in one morning with a short list and returned with coffee lamp wicks, salt, and news that a traveling tinker would pass their way within the week. Evelyn's eyes lit at the thought of needles and small tools. The things she kept mended were holding, but a few spares could make the difference between comfort and a long, cold inconvenience. The tinker came mid-afternoon 2 days later, pushing a cart with one lame wheel that squealed like a bird. He was a narrow man with a tidy beard and eyes that missed nothing. Evelyn traded 2 jars of spiced peaches and a length of cured leather for needles thread, a new awl, and a stovetop kettle with a dent on one side that made it perfect and cheap. The man tipped his hat to her skill in barter. Orion said little, but when the tinker left and the squeal of that wheel faded down the trail, he stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist in a wordless praise of the home she made from small victories. One night long after the lamp was turned down and the coals banked low, Evelyn woke with a roll of nausea that surprised her. She rose carefully not to wake Orion and stepped outside to breathe the dark air. The stars scattered like seeds across the sky. When she returned, Orion had already propped himself on an elbow, eyes soft with concern. She slid beneath the quilt and rested her palm on her stomach, more thought than knowledge. He did not ask. He covered her hand with his and waited with her until the wave passed. The next morning brought thin frost on the trough and a clear resolve. They moved the bed slightly to keep the draft from the wall off her shoulders at night. He caulked the small seam between window frame and log, his knife steady, his breath puffing and white. She heated stones by the hearth and wrapped them in cloth to tuck near their feet when they slept. Small changes, quiet protections. They began the addition to the cabin on a windless Saturday, choosing the lee side where the house would break the worst of the north wind. Orion measured twice and again, then set the first post with a care she recognized from the way he touched her cheek. Evelyn held the beam steady while he fixed it, Together they raised a short skeleton of timber that caught the sun in clean straight lines. Neighbors came by in twos to lend a hand, and by dusk a roof frame sat over their heads like a promise not yet shingled. After the men left, Evelyn ran her fingers over the new joist and saw it all in her mind's eye. A small window catching first light, a shelf for jars, a cot for a child when the world turned loud and sleep needed coaxing. She did not say those last words. She did not have to. Orion stood behind her, the heat of his chest close to her back, and whispered, "I can hear the room already." She smiled because she heard it too, the sound of winter breathing softer. Sunday they rested as much as two people like them could rest. They walked the creek water low and glass pale and found willow branches stripped clean by deer. At the cottonwoods, Evelyn paused where the earth held the small marker for Orion's brother. She knelt without speaking, set a smooth stone she had carried in her apron pocket at the foot of the marker, and let her hand rest there a moment. Orion's shadow fell across the ground beside hers. When she rose and took his hand, their fingers wove in a way that linked the living and the dead without tearing. 2 days later, a cold snap arrived, clear and hard. The first skim of ice formed on the bucket by the door. Evelyn lined the window with quilts she had pieced from his mother's cloth blues and greens, and a stubborn little print with white flowers that refused to look bleak no matter the light. When she tied the last corner, she stepped back and saw the room change. The cabin looked smaller, yes, but also held like cupped hands around a flame. Work outside slowed in the short light. Orion mended harness inside by the hearth. Evelyn cut strips of fabric and began a braided rug for the new room, winding the strands over and under until a circle grew in her lap. The rhythm soothed her unsettled stomach and the itch in her feet that said storms were coming. Sometimes she hummed and sometimes Orion whittled. His knife moved sure along the grain, and a small horse emerged, legs placed as if at a careful walk. When he finished, he did not hand it to her. He set it on the mantel where the blank marriage license had once rested before they filled it with names. The horse looked forward as if it knew where it was going. On a wind-cut morning, a neighbor's boy arrived, breathless with a message that an old woman on the far ridge had taken ill. Evelyn gathered willow bark and a jar of honey without thinking. Orion saddled the mare and lifted her up, then mounted behind the mare's warmth, rising under them both. The ride out was raw, the wind needling cheeks and numbing fingers, but the cabin they found was warm as a held hand. The woman's fever broke after tea and rest. Evelyn stayed 3 hours anyway, watching the breath even out, listening to the old woman speak of winters that had tried harder and failed. When they left, the sun stooped low and threw their shadows long across the snowless ground. On the way home, they rode in a quiet that was not empty. Halfway down the ridge, Evelyn said, "I think we should teach the mare to stand at a wagon sooner than later. The trail to town turns slick when frost comes." Orion made a soft sound of agreement and shifted his weight so that his coat fell over both their legs. After a time, he added, "We could ask Ben to trade for a set of chains." The matter settled itself between them the way many things did now, with a single suggestion and the knowledge the other would carry it forward. The first snow arrived almost shy, a curtain of small flakes sifting through good light. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched them hover and melt on the threshold. Orion came up behind her, his chin finding its place on her shoulder, as if it had been carved for it. They did not speak. They watched as the yard took on that first astonishment of white, the world quieting under it. When at last she stepped out and let flakes catch on her sleeve, she laughed under her breath at the cold prickle and leaned back into him. He laughed too low, and the sound placed them inside the day like a pin in a map. That evening, they did not light the lamp until they had to. The fire threw a warm sway across the floorboards while the snow made its slow, silent case outside. Evelyn lay with her head on Orion's chest, and he traced a lazy circle along the inside of her wrist, the gesture he returned to when words felt like too large a tool. After a while, with the sound of the fire settling and the weight of the quilt holding them small and safe, she said, "I think we will need that extra bed sooner than we planned." He did not start. His palm simply stilled over her wrist, then spread until it covered her hand and a little of her forearm too. "We will build it strong," he answered, and neither of them meant only wood. The next day was clear and cruel, bright sun over biting air. They took turns near the pump to fill the barrels, wrapping strips of cloth around the handle so the iron would not burn their skin. Inside, Evelyn set the new kettle on and added a shaving of ginger from a precious jar. When the steam rose, she poured 2 cups and carried one to Orion, where he sat on the floor with a scattering of nails and a board across his knees. He looked up at her, and in that glance she felt all the words they did not need. I see you. I am here. We are doing this together. They drank in silence, the kind that listens while the light thinned. The new frame of the room cast a long shadow across the yard, a shape not yet walled, but already sheltering. Before dark, Orion pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and carved their initials into the top of one fresh post, small and plain. When he came back in, he smelled of cold and clean wood, and Evelyn's chest ached in that sweet, inconvenient way that tells a person they are alive in the right life. That night, the wind rose and prowled the eaves, but inside the cabin the fire held. Evelyn turned on her side and set Orion's hand where she wanted it, a quiet, gentle placing. His fingers curved to match. The baby they had not named turned like a shy fish far below the surface, or perhaps that was only hope moving under her ribs. Either way, she slept, and when she dreamed, it was of a room with a small window, a braided rug on the floor, and dawn arriving not as a shock, but as a soft hand on the door. The snow lay heavy across the hills by January, turning fences into low white lines and bearing the stubble of corn until the fields looked like blank pages. The sky pressed low gray and constant, and each morning began with the slow ritual of stirring the fire back to life. Evelyn rose before the first light wrapped in shawl and wool coat and carried a bucket to the barn where her breath clouded and the cattle stamped for feed. The rhythm of winter was different, less running, more tending, a patience that asked as much of the heart as the hands. Inside the cabin, the new room stood half-finished, walls up but not yet sealed tight. The wind whistled through the cracks, so Orion set his shoulders to caulking and hammering while Evelyn stuffed old cloth into the seams. They worked side by side, their movements slow but steady, pausing only when her breath grew short or her stomach rolled. Orion would glance at her without comment, fetching the stool so she could sit a moment before resuming. There was no fuss, no worry spoken aloud, only a quiet acknowledgement that her body was carrying more than its own weight now. Neighbors brought word from town whenever they passed. Sickness had spread in the lowlands, fever taking 2 children. Evelyn brewed willow bark and kept jars of honey near though the fever never reached their ridge. She thought often of the old woman they had helped in autumn, wondered if she had lived to see snow on her roof. The land had its mercies and its cruelties, and sometimes they arrived in the same season. Nights were long. Orion carved by the fire, smoothing wood into shapes of birds, horses, once even a cradle figure that made her throat tighten. She sewed in the glow of the coals, patching shirts until her fingers ached. Sometimes they read from her worn book of stories, his voice rough but steady over the faded pages. Sometimes they said nothing at all. The silence between them, a language grown familiar, shaped by the crack of logs and the slow ticking of the mantel clock. One night as the wind screamed through the trees, Evelyn woke with a start. A sound had risen from the new room, soft but distinct. She sat up, heart racing, only to find Orion already on his feet, lamp in hand. Together they stepped into the half-built space. The wind had shaken a loose shingle free, letting snow drift through the gap. Orion climbed the ladder in the dark, sealing it as best he could. When he returned, dusted with flakes, she wrapped a blanket around his shoulders without a word. He caught her hand in his, held it long, then guided her back to bed. Neither spoke of fear, but both carried the reminder that the world beyond their walls could still breach. In February, the thaw came, sudden snow sliding from the roof in heavy sheets. Water roared through the creek, swollen high, carrying branches and debris. Evelyn stood on the bank one morning, coat tight against her, and watched the current drag away a whole fence post from farther up. Orion came beside her, hands on hips, measuring the force with his eyes. "We'll need to shift the line back, come spring," he said. She nodded, the truth plain. The land always asked adjustments, never allowing anyone to settle entirely. Later that week, while clearing driftwood near the shed, Evelyn felt a flutter inside her, unlike anything she had known. She froze, palm pressed to her belly, breath caught. It came again, a quick, light movement gone as soon as it arrived. Tears pricked her eyes before she could stop them. When Orion found her standing still in the cold, he reached for her elbow. "You all right?" She turned to him, voice trembling. She moved. His gaze sharpened, then softened in the same breath. He set his palm gently atop hers as if afraid to press too hard. When nothing came again, he didn't withdraw. He left his hand there, steady, waiting with her. From that day, the work of winter shifted. Every board nailed, every seam patched, every jar sealed became a preparation, not just for them, but for the life-stirring unseen. Orion built the cradle with extra care, carving stars into the headboard. Evelyn braided another rug, this one smaller, the strands tight and strong. When she laid it beside the cradle, she imagined tiny hands reaching across it, the sound of laughter rising above the winter hush. March came with longer light. The snow retreated patch by patch, revealing the dark soil beneath. Saplings stood thin but alive, buds swelling at their tips. Evelyn walked among them, her hand brushing the cloth. Ties whispering small hopes into the wind. Orion joined her, his arm warm against her back. "They'll take root," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "So will we." When they returned to the cabin, the air inside smelled of stew, simmering low, and wood smoke clinging to every seam. The new room stood ready, walls tight, roof sound, waiting. She paused in the doorway, hand resting on the frame, and felt the weight of all they had built, not just shelter, but a place where love grew into something larger than either had known alone. April came in soft and green, the hills washed with fresh grass that bent under the wind like waves. The creek, once swollen and angry, had settled into clear, steady water, and Evelyn found herself kneeling by its edge, soaking cloths in the coolness, humming without knowing she did. The days carried a new rhythm now, slower and heavier, as her belly grew rounder, but never without work. She weeded the small garden patch, mended the quilts, and stirred pots of beans until the scent filled the cabin. Orrin took more of the heavy lifting, though he never said so outright. When she reached for the water barrel, he was there to carry it. When she bent too long over the soil, he came with a hand beneath her elbow. She teased him for watching her like a hawk, but the truth was she drew strength from it. Once she might have bristled at such attention, but now it meant safety, partnership, the assurance that whatever weight she bore, he bore it too. The apple trees budded white and pink, delicate against the rough posts of the fence. One evening, as the sun lowered into gold, Evelyn stood beneath them, fingers brushing the blossoms. "They'll fruit one day," she whispered. Orion came up behind her, his hand resting gentle at the small of her back. "So will we." She turned, caught the faint smile at the corner of his mouth, and laid her head against his chest. The trees swayed, their petals drifting down like quiet blessings. As the weeks passed, the neighbors stopped by more often, bringing gifts of cloth jars, of preserves, a hand-me-down cradle blanket. One woman, Mary Johnson, pressed a bundle of tiny shirts into Evelyn's hands and said, "Babies grow faster than you can blink. Better to be ready." Evelyn smoothed the fabric with reverence, marveling at how small they were. She thought of her own childhood, the fire that had taken her parents, the years of being passed like an unwanted parcel. Now she would have a child who would never wonder where she belonged. On a warm morning, Orion saddled the mare and asked if she wanted to ride with him to town. She hesitated, hand on her belly, but then nodded. "I'd like to see it again." The trail wound through budding mesquite and open prairie where bluebonnets spread like a painted cloth. She sat straight in the saddle, determined, and Orion kept a steady pace beside her, ready should she falter. In town, eyes turned toward them, but not with suspicion anymore. The shopkeeper greeted her by name, and the blacksmith's wife asked after her health. It struck her how quickly she had gone from stranger to neighbor, from outcast to someone who belonged. They bought seed lamp oil and a length of muslin. At the counter, Evelyn pulled a small pouch from her apron, coins she had saved from trading preserves. She placed them down before Orion could stop her. "For the cloth," she said firmly. He raised a brow but said nothing. Later on the ride home, he glanced over and said, "I like that you claim your part." She smiled, the wind tugging at her hair. "It's ours. Every coin, every board, every stitch." He reached out, brushing his fingers over hers on the reins. "That it is." By late May, the heat returned, carrying with it the hum of cicadas. Evelyn moved slower, resting more often, but her hands never stayed idle. She sewed shirts with careful seams, baked bread when the mornings were cool, and sat on the porch in the evenings, with her feet propped on the rail. Orion often joined her carving in silence, or simply watching the horizon. Sometimes when the baby kicked, she caught his hand and pressed it against her belly. The look that came over his face then, wonder, disbelief, fierce tenderness, made her throat ache. As June began, storms swept across the ridge. Lightning cracked the sky open and rain drummed the roof like fists. One night the thunder shook so loud that Evelyn startled awake. Orion gathered her close, steady as a rock. "Storms pass," he murmured against her hair. She clung to him, her heart pounding, and found herself whispering, "Don't ever leave me to face them alone." His arms tightened. Never. The baby's time drew near in July. Evelyn felt it in her bones, in the deep ache of her back, in the way her breath shortened. She prepared as her mother once had taught her before the fire, boiling cloths, setting aside jars of honey water, laying the cradle with fresh linens. Orion built shelves in the new room, his hammering steady his presence, a constant reassurance. One evening, as they sat watching the horizon darken, Evelyn turned to him. "Are you afraid?" He thought a long moment before answering. "Not of the child, not of the work, only of failing you." She reached for his hand, fingers threading tight. "You've never failed me, not once." The first pains came with the rising sun, sharp and insistent. Orion stayed by her side, fetching water, holding her hand silent, except for the words she needed most. "You can do this. I'm right here." Hours stretched, sweat beaded her brow, and she cried out against the force of it. When at last the cry of their child filled the cabin, thin and strong, she collapsed against the pillows, with tears streaming down her face. Orion placed the tiny bundle in her arms, his rough hands trembling. The baby's eyes blinked open, dark and steady, and Evelyn whispered, "Clara." The name rose like a prayer. Clara for clear skies after storm. Clara for the life they had carved from hardship. Orion sat beside her, his arms circling them both. "Welcome home," he murmured to the child, voice breaking. Evelyn looked at him, at the man who had offered her a porch, or his bed, who had given her instead a whole life. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the baby warm between them, and whispered, "We're home." The weeks after Clara's birth blurred into a rhythm of sleepless nights and tender mornings. Dawn broke soft across the ridge, lighting the cabin in gold, while Clara's cries rose sharp and insistent. Evelyn, weary but glowing with a new kind of strength, nursed and soothed her body, aching yet steady. Orion kept the fire alive, brewed coffee strong, and carried buckets with quiet urgency, so she never had to rise when she didn't want to. They moved as one, bound now, by more than vows or work, but by the fragile heartbeat of a child who carried both their names. Neighbors came in twos and threes, bringing gifts: a quilt stitched by Mary Johnson, a basket of cornmeal jars of molasses. The men clapped Orion's shoulder, speaking little, but leaving behind wood nails or a hand with the cattle. The women gathered round Clara, cooing soft, their eyes kind. Evelyn accepted each gift with gratitude, marveling at how far she had come from the girl who once collapsed on a stranger's porch. Now she was wife, mother, and neighbor, rooted deep. The saplings behind the shed, planted months before, had pushed taller, their leaves trembling in summer wind. Evelyn carried Clara out to them one afternoon. The baby swaddled close and whispered, "These trees will be here when you're grown." Orion came up behind her, his hand resting lightly at her back. "They'll fruit for her," he said. She looked up at him, eyes full, and answered, "So will we." As the heat of August bore down, the work of the ranch called again. Calves needed tending, fences, mending the cornfield, watching for pests. Evelyn insisted on helping where she could. She strapped Clara into a sling across her chest, her hands free to gather eggs, to weed the garden. Orion worried but didn't stop her. Instead, he adjusted the straps, tied the knots tighter, his jaw set in that way she had come to recognize as love expressed without words. One evening after the chores, they sat on the porch. Clara asleep between them in a cradle Orion had carved with stars along the headboard. The air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle, and the cicadas sang as if the whole world hummed with life. Evelyn leaned against Orion, her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think of the life you had before me?" she asked. His arm curved around her. "Sometimes, but it feels more like a shadow than a life." This, he nodded toward the cradle. "This is the real thing." She smiled through sudden tears. "I thought I'd never find it. I thought maybe it wasn't meant for me." He tilted her chin, eyes steady as oak. "It was always meant. It just had to wait for the right time. September brought cooler nights and the first hints of frost in the air. Orion cut wood in longer shifts, stacking it high, while Evelyn set about drying herbs and storing what harvest they could. Clara had grown heavier, her eyes bright and searching. She gripped Orion's finger with surprising strength, and he laughed low as though the sound startled him from his own chest. They marked their marriage in small ways. No preacher, no grand gathering, but each day spoke its vow. When Orion carved their initials into a new fence post, Evelyn laid her palm over the letters. When she pieced together a quilt with cloth from his mother's trunk, he spread it across their bed without a word. They planted a cherry tree beside the others, this one for Clara. Together they watched the wind move through its young branches, and Evelyn thought of the day it would blossom petals scattering like blessings over her daughter's hair. Winter came again fierce and unyielding, but they faced it as they had learned to do together. Evelyn hummed while she cooked, Clara gurgling in her cradle, Orion carving by the fire. Storms raged outside, snow swept across the land, but within those walls was warmth that had nothing to do with flame. On one clear night after the baby had settled, they stepped out beneath a sky thick with stars. The cold beds sharped their breath, rising in clouds, but the world felt wide and steady. Orion wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close. "Do you remember the night you came here?" he asked softly. She shivered, not from the cold. "I remember smoke fear running. I remember collapsing on your porch, not knowing if I'd live past dawn." He pressed his lips to her hair, and now, she turned to him, eyes shining. "Now I know I chose right. I chose your arms." His gaze held hers, fierce and tender, both. "And I'll carry you every day. That choice is mine to keep." They stood there a long while, the land stretching around them, the trees whispering in the wind, the house behind them glowing with the faint light of the hearth. And for the first time in a life of loss and flight, Evelyn Ashford Zeller felt not just safe, not just loved, but home, utterly, unshakably home.